My wife watches it. She loves it.
What?
Bull? Bull, it's a television show.
Oh,
Okay, it's about, what's his name? Dr. Phil. Phil McGraw. Anyway, it's about his early life. He was a jury consultant, and that's how he made all of his millions and millions of dollars. Now, and then of course, he was a jury consultant for Oprah, and then Oprah said, "You're brilliant. You have to come on my television show." And then he started coming on her television show, and then the rest is history. I know, as stupid as all that sounds. The same way with Rachel Ray. Rachel Ray's not a chef, as strange as that may seem. She just she was a cook that had, that used to mix different foods together. And evidently she fed Oprah at one point, and Oprah just went gaga over her, and then she started coming on her television show. But Dr. Phil was a jury consultant. And now, of course, he's a multi-millionaire because he had problems with a couple marriages, but other than that, Dr. Phil, now he's on television doing all kinds of odd things. Anyway, okay, so trial lawyers often apply their implicit personality theories to jury selection, and that's what happens next. Of course, they're not the brightest people in the world. An interesting thing about juries, once upon a time, wait a minute. Interesting thing about juries, now I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, anyway. Oh, that's what I was going to say. When I was in college, we didn't have a pre-law program at my college, but we did have a pre-med program, and like it was insane. We had like 55% of my graduating class became doctors. But the individuals that wanted to be lawyers, and we had a lot of lawyers in our class too, most of them were psychology majors or political science majors, but most of them were psychology majors. And they became pretty good lawyers, actually, because they understood people, and they understood when people were lying. An implicit personality theory is a person's organized network of preconceptions about how certain attributes are related to one another and to behavior. Implicit personality theories may be mistaken, of course. You may think that all poor people act in a select way, or all wealthy people. When I keep telling you about wealthy people, well, that's my implicit personality theory of the wealthy. I've been around a lot of wealthy people, unfortunately, and they seem to have a paranoid personality of sorts. They don't trust anybody. They think everybody's after their money, which in a way may be true. I still can't figure out why people put up with Donald Trump, but he's a wealthy guy. Wealthy people get away with stuff all the time because people think that they will give them money. People like to be around them because they think they're going to give away their money, which they never do. It's a little odd. It costs more money to be around wealthy people than it does that you'll make more money being around wealthy people. That sounded horrible, didn't it? Another common strategy is based on the assumption that jurors who are demographically or socially similar to a litigant will be predisposed to favor that litigant. This is known as the similarity leniency hypothesis. So if I had if we're trying an African American for murder, I'd try to fill the jury with African Americans. If it was a wealthy white guy, I would try to fill the jury with wealthy white guys if I could find them. Of course, they never go to jury duty anyway, but I would try to put the two together. Just recently, a lot of information has been coming out about white supremacy. Evidently, one of the speechwriters for Trump has been espousing white supremacy for an extended length of time. We knew that he was kind of a jerk. His name's Stephen Miller. He looks like a Nazi out of Nazi Germany. My God, I don't know. Anyway, he's a really weird guy. He's very he's very specific about everything that he believes. Kind of an interesting fellow. Anyway, he was espousing white supremacist ideas, and he was referring to white supremacy websites, as he was sending all this stuff to Breitbart once upon a time. Anyway, now everybody's screaming for his head. They want him fired, which probably isn't going to happen. Alternatively, the black sheep effect may apply. People may sanction those who reflect negatively on and embarrass the in-group, and of course you hear this hypothesis as well. If you have an individual who's African American, you don't want to put African Americans on the jury because they will think that he is reflecting badly on them. Therefore, they'll put him away for a longer period of time. And this is known as the black sheep effect. As weird as that is. Do jurors' demographic characteristics predict the verdicts? Many attorneys actively select or deselect jurors on the basis of demographic information, and this may be incorrect. Now you have to remember that most lawyers were pre-law, then they went to law school. They're not psychologists, not like graduates of Wabash College. They were all most of them were psychology majors, and then they went into law. But most lawyers are not psychologists. Demographic characteristics of jurors and juries are sometimes related to their verdicts. However, the correlations are weak and inconsistent from one type of trial to another. And it really all depends on the trial. Is it a criminal case? Is it a civil case? If it's a criminal case, was there violence involved? All of these things have a lot to do with what type of jury you need. And of course, this is what Phil McGraw theoretically was doing as a jury consultant. He knew all of these things. He is a doctor of psychology, so theoretically he was better at picking juries than anybody else. The relationship between demographic characteristics and verdicts also depends on the type of case. For example, in trials that involve issues such as child sexual assault or domestic violence or sexual harassment, women are more likely than men to convict, and in civil trials, women are more inclined than men to perceive that sexual harassment has occurred. It's realistic to women that men are sexual harassers, or they may be more violent. Therefore, they are more likely to convict in cases that have to do with sexual harassment or sexual assault or any type of violence. Research suggests that enduring aspects of one's personalities, for example, authoritarianism, the need for cognition and extroversion, and attitudes may influence courtroom decisions, though usually only to a modest degree. So you have an individual that is fairly authoritarian. They are going to try to take over the jury room. Attorneys may overrule the importance of demographic variables and undervalue the importance of personality variables when making peremptory challenges. Social scientists are skeptical of how much lawyers can accomplish in voir dire. Usually, well, and of course, this is a fairly conflictual. The idea that you can select the right jury or select the wrong jury. The reality is probably that since most lawyers are not psychologists, they really don't have the ability to do that. Unless you're Phil McGraw, of course, and then you can select the right jury. Consultants, scientific jury selection, does it work any better? Consultants use empirically based procedures, including focus groups, shadow juries, and the surveys of the community to identify desirable and undesirable jurors. And if you look at if you've ever seen Bull, that's what he does. He uses shadow juries. He uses focus groups. they select these people out of what they try to do is they try to mirror the jury member with an individual from the community. And of course, they're supposed to have the same demographics and the same personality traits. So during the trial, they monitor, nobody knows what the jury is thinking, but they can monitor this shadow jury to try to determine whether something is being accepted as positive or negative by the jury. This collection of techniques is known as scientific jury selection. And of course, this was not really invented by Phil McGraw, but it's kind of like psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis wasn't really invented by Sigmund Freud, but he perfected it. And Phil McGraw did the same thing. He started working for an individual that was a jury consultant. He improved what the individual did, and he became the Cadillac of jury consultants, Phil McGraw. Scientific jury selection has generated a lot of controversy. Some claim that it favors the wealthy and creates a perception that the system is rigged. And if you think about it, it is rigged, if only the wealthy can afford jury consultants. Now, the interesting thing about Bull, if you've ever watched the television show, he does a lot of pro bono work. As a matter of fact, most of the cases that they show is pro bono. It's the poor guy beating out the rich guy. But of course, that doesn't happen very often. They couldn't keep the place open if they did everything for free. Others claim that it is ineffective, that scientific jury selection is ineffective, so it really doesn't matter. How effective are trial consultants? The success rate may have been inflated by the following factors. Many of the more widely discussed cases involved weak or controversial evidence against defendants, and attorneys who made the extra effort to enlist jury consultation resources may also have been more diligent and thorough in other areas of the case preparation. So you never know. You can't compare two cases. It just doesn't work that way. Sometimes the evidence is stronger. Even if the evidence is identical, you've got different lawyers. You have different techniques that the lawyers are using. Of course, you've got a different jury. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. It just doesn't work that way. You can't compare one case with the other. Horowitz in 1980 determined that traditional methods were superior in cases in which there were weak links between demographic, personality, and attitudinal factors. For example, in a murder case, whereas scientific methods were superior when those associations were strong, such as in a drug sale case. Drug sale cases, of course, are fairly cut and dried. Murder cases aren't. We just had the murder case. People keep shooting each other. The case in, where was it? They were having a football party, and somebody just came up and started blasting away into the crowd, and they killed 4 people and wounded 9. I think it was in California. Then they had the school shooting on Friday, I think, Santa Clarita, Saugus High School. On Friday, and then yesterday they had the shooting at Walmart, in the parking lot of Walmart in Duncan, Oklahoma. Has anybody ever been to Duncan? It's just north of Comanche, which is just east of Lawton. Lawton is where Fort Sill is. Anyway, it's a pretty big town. It's got about, 26,000 people. It's a pretty big town. Perhaps trial consultants are most effective in cases in which jurors' attitudes are particularly important. In some, many agree that in most cases the evidence is more important than jurors' attitudes or demographic characteristics. As long as the evidence is there, then the case is going to be seen in a select way. Doesn't really matter whether you're a soccer mom or a stripper at the local strip joint. It really doesn't matter. The evidence is going to dictate how you're going to find the case. Scientific jury selection may be of limited value in cases where the evidence is unambiguous, such as in drug trials, of course. Conflicting rights, pretrial publicity highlights tensions between two rights protected by the U.S. Constitution. The first one is freedom of the press as guaranteed by the First Amendment. We have First Amendment rights. We have the right to say anything that we want to, as long as it's not destructive and as long as it's not libelous. A case was just heard by the Supreme Court yesterday where they said that if you are a public figure, then someone can satirize you. And this is what Donald Trump was trying to sue somebody because they had made fun of him. The other thing was he tried to sue the people that have the Trump baby balloon. You know, the one where he's crying and he's wearing a diaper. It's a big blimp. We first saw it in England.
Didn't they knife it down or something?
They did. They did in Alabama, in Tuscaloosa, at the football game. Somebody came up and punched a hole in it. And of course, he was arrested for punching a hole in the balloon. That was their First Amendment rights. They had the right to demonstrate against the president, but the president had tried to sue them for libel, since it was satire, and the Supreme Court decided that you can't do that. That if you are a public figure, then you can be satirized. So we have the right, the First Amendment right, which is the right of a free press, the right of someone to say something. The second right is the right to a speedy and public trial before an impartial jury as guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. So we have two amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment says you can say anything that you want, and the Second Amendment says that you should have a speedy and public trial with an impartial jury. These two rights clash when the press publishes information that threatens a defendant's rights to a trial by impartial jurors. Now this is really kind of tough because we've got that case in Albuquerque where the mother tried to sell her daughter, where she did sell her daughter on the internet. I guess it was her boyfriend that raped and murdered her 10-year-old daughter, and it was his cousin that helped. Anyway, so this case has been publicized. I mean, it has national publicity. So how in the world will we ever give them a fair trial? I guess the trial is already over with, isn't it? Haven't they tried all three of them? I think they have. There was a case in New York State where the mother, let's see, how did this work? Where the boyfriend raped the 5-year-old girl, and the mother knew it was happening, and she didn't do anything. Of course, the information, it came out that he had done this, so they took him to trial, and he lost, of course, and they put him in prison for like 10 years. And then they took her to trial, and because she didn't protect the daughter, they put her in prison for 30 years. I know, as interesting as that is. She didn't do the raping, but she didn't protect her daughter. As curious as that is. So what we're talking about is we're talking about pre-trial publicity. Of course, newspapers, the television, news programs are trying to sell. They want people to watch their show. So they're certainly going to use anything that will get people to watch the show or to read their newspaper. So they have a right to print anything that they want. Sometimes it's very libelous. Legal rulings on pretrial publicity in Rideau versus Louisiana in 1963. The court decided that exposure to news with information strongly pointing to the defendant's guilt was a violation of due process. So what do you do if you've got a violation of due process? Well, there are some things that you can do, and we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter. In Mu Min versus Virginia in 1991, the court held that if prospective jurors claim that they can be impartial, defendants do not have a constitutional right to ask them about the specifics of their exposure to pretrial publicity. In other words, if they were listening to conspiracy radio, or they were listening to Rush Limbaugh, or they were reading Breitbart, you can't ask them, well, where did you get your information? You can't ask them that, and that came out in 1991. Okay, so what was happening in 1991? There was a movement in the United States to incarcerate more people. It was a law and order movement in the United States. And people were getting out because, look, they would say things like, well, look at all this publicity. You can't, you have to move my trial someplace else. And of course, that costs a lot of money. It delays the trial. It delays the whole process. So there was a law and order movement going on in the 1990s. And a lot of Supreme Court decisions that we see came out in the 1990s because all of this law and order stuff was being decided by the Supreme Court. Two types of studies. So how in the world do we figure out how publicity works? Whether publicity is really a negative thing or not? Well, there are two ways that we can do this. There are two types of studies that we can do. In an experimental study, participants are either exposed or not exposed to some form of publicity, and then are asked to assume the role of jurors in a simulated trial. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is in field studies. Community respondents are surveyed to assess the effects of naturally occurring publicity about an actual case. So one is completely in the laboratory, where we take individuals, we give them a piece of information, and then we make them jurors. It's one way to do pre-trial publicity research. The other way to do it is just to canvass the community about a trial. Okay. Conclusion from both types of studies: jurors exposed to pretrial publicity are more likely than those not exposed to favor the prosecution and prejudge the defendant as guilty. So it really doesn't matter how you do the experiment, we get the same results. If you are exposed to the information, then you're more likely to prosecute the defendant, to convict them. Experimental studies of the effects of pretrial publicity: because all aspects of the trial except the publicity are held constant, scientists can assess whether variations in publicity cause differences in responses. Now this is really kind of an interesting situation. I could talk about research as if all of it was pure, any ideas that people had, any way of doing a piece of research worked. But the reality is sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they're making assumptions that don't really fit. And this may be one of them. This may be one of the situations where there's just no way that we can measure this. We would like to. It would be nice if we could, but there's just no way that we can do it. Now, how in the world are you going to construct an experiment so that it will give us the information that we're looking for? This may be one of those instances where we cannot replicate the situation so that we know what's going on. These studies generally show that pretrial publicity affects jurors' evaluation of the defendant's character and criminality, the extent to which they like or sympathize with the defendant, their pretrial sentiments about guilt, and their final verdicts. The biggest problem is that usually when they talk about a defendant, they talk about his criminal past. How many times has he been convicted of a crime? Well, that prejudices the individual, that prejudices the prospective juror to what he has done in the past. So from what he has done in the past, we assume that he's going to do it in the future. The assumption is that he's going to do it in the future. You can't erase that from your mind. Now, in trial, they won't allow that information to come out. But if it's already been in the newspaper, and you've read the newspaper, then you know what his criminal past has been. And normally, that's the first thing that we talk about. We talk about their mental health history. We're going to find out about the mental health of the individual that shot the two people in the parking lot of Walmart. We're going to find out what's going on with that guy.
That happened in, where did that happen?
Duncan, Oklahoma.
Oh, what were you guys talking about yesterday about Farmington?
There was a shooting in Aztec, and because of that,
Oh.
they had active shooter drills in Farmington. That's what they're talking. Nobody's been shot at the Walmart in Farmington.
It's like a hard time.
And the other question would be, isn't it the white one or is it the
See,
native
that's
one?
what,
That's
I walked
what-
in when it was at that.
See, you miss all the good stuff. But all this is very important. I mean, because we can convict somebody, not because of what they did, but because what they did 15 years ago or 30 years ago. And this is one of the reasons why that doesn't come out in trial. You're not allowed to bring this out at trial because somebody can be convicted for something they did previously and not what is happening right now. Why do these effects occur? Pretrial publicity may bias jurors' interpretations of the evidence to which they are exposed at trial. Jurors exposed to publicity come to believe wrongly that the pretrial information was presented as part of the trial evidence. They've got all this information in their mind and they can't remember what is evidence and what is some reporter's fantasy. This is known as source monitoring error, where they can't remember where they got the information. Pretrial publicity often elicits emotional responses which are associated with jurors' verdicts. The best reporters are the ones that can induce emotions in you. So they they'll talk about a scene so that it will make you feel sad or empathy or anger toward the individual that did the shooting. We're still trying to figure out what happened at that football party. All of the people at the party were Asian. So was the individual that shot up the party, was he Asian as well? Is this a community situation or is this a racial situation? Was it somebody who didn't like Asians, for example? Presentation of publicity via television has been found to have a greater biasing impact than information presented in print, but the combined effect of television and newspaper publicity had the greatest impact. So if we're getting the same information on the television that we are getting from the newspapers, then that will have the greatest impact. Now this is really kind of interesting, because if you own a television station, you're not allowed to own a newspaper. If you own a newspaper, you can't own a television station. And the reason they do that is so that they can't, a select individual can't control all the media, all the ideas. They want different ideas coming in to the individual. So they can both be conservative, but they can't be owned by the same individual. And of course, media moguls have tried to do this. They've tried to control not just the print media, but also the televised media. And of course, the Supreme Court wouldn't allow them to do that. Participants are generally unaware that their opinions have been biased by this material, and this is the problem, that we don't realize what's going on. We don't understand that all this stuff has already been implanted in our brains. If I watch Fox News, then I get one idea. If I watch CNN, I get a totally different idea. Fox News is attacking the impeachment inquiry. They're saying it's a hoax, it's a witch hunt. And of course, if you watch CNN, that's all they talk about. And whether this means that he's actually going to be he's actually going to be convicted of, or he's actually going to go to trial for, he is on trial for impeachment. No, the trial is in the Senate. This gets a little confusing. The House brings the, will bring the articles of impeachment. They are the ones that create the articles of impeachment with an inquiry, and then they send it to the Senate and they have to try it. They don't have a choice. The Constitution says they have to have a trial. So at some point, within the next 3 or 4 months, we're going to have an impeachment trial. As much fun as that is. Case-specific information made available prior to trial can affect the sentiments of jurors in that trial. And of course, if you have an individual that likes or dislikes a select individual, they will present them in either the best light or the worst light. So if you've got a newspaper that hates, well, for example, if you've ever read a newspaper, if you read the Phoenix Sun, if you read the Daily Oklahoman, if you read the Los Angeles Times, where was I? Quad City Times up in Iowa, the Des Moines Register. If you read these newspapers, a lot of times they will show the Gallup Independent, for example. The Gallup Independent, if somebody commits a crime and they're white, they don't put their picture in the paper. If somebody's native and they commit a crime, no matter what it was, they usually put their picture in the paper, which makes it look like only natives commit crimes. It's the same way with select newspapers and African Americans. They will show pictures of African Americans who commit crimes, but not white people that commit crimes. You almost never see a white criminal in the newspaper. You just see tons and tons of black criminals in the newspaper. Somebody beats up his wife, he gets his picture in the paper, if he's black. If he's white, they don't even mention it, as weird as that sounds. So we can prejudice people. We can prejudice them with the type of media that we, or the pictures that we show in the newspaper, or the stories that we talk about on our news programs. Jurors can also be influenced by generic prejudice, prejudice arising from media coverage of issues not specifically related to a particular case, but thematically relevant to the issues at hand. Everybody hates child molesters. Let's say somebody has sex in a select way. Lots of different ways to have sex, and if it's considered deviant sexual behavior. This is what happened to poor old Bill Clinton. Bill had sex with an intern, but he didn't have genital sex with the intern. And because he didn't have genital sex, they acted as if he were some kind of a god-awful pervert. Of course, most of the people that were trying him, Ken Starr and some of the more conservative people, didn't recognize any other type of sex. And they saw any other type of sex as deviant, as weird as that sounds. Now, once upon a time, unless sex was, actually it's the same way today, unless the sex is genital sex, it's known as sodomy, as weird as that sounds. So if it's anal intercourse, it's sodomy. If it's oral intercourse, it's sodomy, as strange as that sounds. Okay, so we're modern people, my goodness gracious, is that all we understand? And the answer is yes. The United States military, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, interprets sodomy as unnatural sex, as sex other than genital sex, as weird as that may sound. So if two people have an affair and one of them is married, then that's adultery as far as the UCMJ is concerned. If they have other than genital sex, then they get charged with sodomy, as weird as that may sound. I mean, whose business is it how two people have sex? And the answer is, societies. It's society that gets to decide whether it's deviant sexual behavior. So when they started talking about poor Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, they were talking about an individual that didn't actually have genital sex with them. They didn't have genital sex, and of course she was complaining that she was so frustrated and whatnot. So they only had oral sex and digital sex, I guess. He used a cigar. I know. And everybody was just so shocked, that this was taking place, that the President of the United States would have anything other than genital sex with anybody. Generic prejudice may be more problematic than specific pretrial publicity. Poor Jeremiah has to teach human sexuality. He's the one who got that assignment. So we have conversations about this stuff all the time, as interesting or not interesting as that is. Anyway, so he has to talk about these things in class. Take human sexuality, it'll be a blast. And we do have generic prejudices against sex, as weird as that may seem. For the longest time, of course, homosexuality was considered a mental illness. And then in the 70s, they decided, wait a minute, it's not a mental illness. This is natural. It's just not procreative, okay? It's kind of like mutual masturbation or something. Anyway, so then now we have decided that people of the same gender can marry one another. And now we've kind of gotten to the point where we've come up with all these different terms for people, and I don't know what half of them mean. I mean, what is being queer? What does that mean? I was reading something the other day, and they said 3 of the women identified as lesbian, and 5 of the men identified as being gay, and 2 people identified as being queer, and 3 people were transgender. And I'm going, huh? Well, I don't understand. I have to ask Jeremiah what being queer is, but does anybody know what queer means? What that means at all?
I didn't know that they still use the term queer.
LGBTQ community. It's the LGBTQ community. The Q stands for queer. So it's obviously something specific.
I'm not
And
sure.
it's not lesbian, and it's not gay. It's not bisexual, it's not transgender.
I think for me, it just, the way people use it, or when guys use it, they kind of just interpret it as a guy acting a lot more feminine. Just,
Okay.
yeah, feminine wise.
Okay.
They're not gay or anything, they're just
Okay.
really feminine.
But but it doesn't have anything to do with sexual orientation?
It does sometimes, but sometimes it can be misinterpreted in a lot of ways. Like when a guy acts a lot more feminine,
More
like I
effeminate?
said,
How
or
about if a
sexual
woman
orientation.
acts really butch? Would that be the same thing?
Yeah, it'd be like that same term.
Okay.
She's
All right.
butch.
Okay. Now I know. Okay. Interesting. I was reading Facebook the other day, and there's like 52 different ways you can identify yourself. And I don't really care, it just, some of them are very confusing. And I don't want to be confused. I want to understand people. That's my goal in life, is to understand people. Researchers have found that persons exposed to pretrial publicity possess more knowledge about the events in question. They read the newspaper, they watch the news. They're more likely to have prejudged the case. In other words, when they read about the case, they made determinations as to what was, whether the individual was guilty or innocent. They're more knowledgeable about incriminating facts that would be inadmissible at the trial. And of course, the The reporters are trying to put anything in there that they possibly can. They're trying to scoop somebody else. It is rare for a city to have more than one newspaper these days. A lot of people read U.S. News and World Report, which is a national newspaper. So it has very little local news in it. It's got like a page of local news in it. So it's not the way it used to be. Once upon a time, you would have competing newspapers, and maybe one would be more conservative than the other would be. There's the Washington Post and there's another Washington newspaper that's conservative. New York has two newspapers, Chicago has two newspapers. One is conservative and one is more liberal. Strengths, they use large and representative samples of prospective jurors, and they rely on naturally occurring publicity about actual cases. We're talking about research into pretrial publicity. The weaknesses of this research, the data are correlational in nature, so it doesn't really, and it only applies to a select case. Using multiple methods to assess effects of pretrial publicity, Daftery Kapoor in 2009 found that regardless of whether exposure was experimentally manipulated or naturally occurring, those who had read pro-prosecution versus pro-defense articles were more familiar with the case and more likely to judge the defendants guilty prior to trial. These are the individuals that are paying attention. They're more likely to have made a determination. Exposure occurred 8 weeks before rendered verdicts, suggesting that the effects of pretrial publicity may be long-lived. In other words, or live. You can say it. Is that clock right? Not even close. You screwed it up, didn't you?
Yeah.
Good job. It doesn't matter.
I was wondering if it's still going, if someone changed the battery without changing it.
Well, the second hand's moving around. I wonder if the hands are just loose or something. You just never know. Okay, so what do we do about this pretrial publicity? Well, there's 4 things that we can do. Well, we can postpone the trial. This is known as a continuance. That's one way to do it. We can postpone the trial, and we can give them more time so that the publicity dissipates. A good example is the shooting in Duncan yesterday. It was all over the news. Look for it this morning. I had to go to local news in Oklahoma in order to find out what was going on. CNN didn't cover it. We still have coverage of the school shooting in California, but not, and the shooting at the football party, but not the shooting at the Walmart in Oklahoma. It just happened yesterday. It's nowhere. I couldn't find it anywhere on CNN. Why not? What's going on? Why is murder-suicide not important? A shooting at Walmart. Now, why in the world would that not be important? The school shooting is still important. We're still talking about the school shooting.
But the other one was a murder-suicide?
It was a murder-suicide. The guy came up and shot the couple and then he shot himself.
Maybe because it's like an open and shut case like that. Like they already know who did it, so it's like,
Well, it's the
okay.
same way in the school shooting. The kid shot himself. He pumped away at his classmates. He saved the last bullet for his own head. Only three people died. See, we've got three school kids died, and then
That's
a
terrible.
couple and a guy died in a.
So the people in Duncan, did they know each other? Like, were they family?
See, that's the question.
That's,
We don't know. We don't even know who the other 2 people are yet. They, of course, the cops know, but they're not publicizing the names of these people. Somebody said that they thought that they knew each other. So, but that's all we've got is hearsay. we don't have any definite reasons as to why this guy blasted away on the couple. And the guy that shot up the football party is still at large in California. That's kind of exciting. So that makes sense that would still be on the news. But why did Duncan fall out of the news so fast? Duncan, Oklahoma.
I don't know.
Some of the richest people in the United States are named Walton. Of the 5 richest people in the United States, 3 of them are named Walton. They own Walmart. Does that have something to do with it? Do you remember when we had the huge shooting in El Paso in the Walmart? The guy was shooting Hispanics. He went in with a military rifle and started blasting away at Hispanics. Remember that in El Paso? You don't remember that? It was 2 days later that in Virginia, some guy had tactical combat gear on and went into a Walmart in Virginia. So it looked like Walmart, all of a sudden Walmart was attracting these individuals. So what happened next? Walmart stopped selling ammunition. It's like 20% of their sales is ammunition. They stopped selling, they still sell guns, but they don't sell ammunition. Okay, so Walmart did that. And now all of a sudden we've got another Walmart case. So could this have something to do with publicity as far as Walmart's concerned? Why did it fall out of the news so fast? Why can I only find information if I look up the Daily Oklahoma? This doesn't make any sense. Just
Try to make
just
themselves look good.
the Waltons don't like the idea that it looks, people are going to be afraid to go to Walmart because people get shot at Walmart. Anyway, okay, so we have continuance is one way to remedy the pretrial publicity. The other is expanded voir dire. This is the most popular method. So instead of 100 people, they'll call in 500 people to find prospective jurors. That's number 2. Number 3 is judicial instructions. Of course, research suggests that the three above techniques are largely ineffective. Continuance doesn't work, expanded voir dire doesn't work. Judicial instructions, now forget everything you heard before the trial, you can't do that. You already have all that information. The only way that actually works, the most effective way, is to move the trial out of the city. You have to move it to someplace else. And this is the only one that works. Anyway, change of venue. That's called change of venue. All right. So that was chapter 12, and this is chapter 13. Jurors and juries. Okay. Approximately 2/3 of Americans have been called to jury duty, and approximately 1/4 have actually served on as jurors. I've been called practically every place I've ever been. Montana, Nebraska, Iowa. Every time I move someplace, I get called in for jury duty. But then I never go.
Why not?
I never go because I always fill out the form and they always reject it. I have too much education. Nobody wants a smart guy to be on the jury.
Yeah.
That and the fact that I teach every day, so almost every day. So as a teacher, they automatically exclude me. Other people that they would exclude would be psychologists. There you go, once again. Lawyers, other lawyers, they reject lawyers as well. Juries have been criticized, for example, excessive awards of civil juries. Juries also have been defenders. For example, verdicts reached by representative juries can and often do increase the legitimacy of the process in the eyes of the public, particularly in controversial trials. We assume that they are going to be good juries, and if they are going to give us the best verdict. There was a case, the Paul Manafort case. Paul Manafort was really kind of interesting. The evidence against him was kind of a slam dunk. And they charged him with 18 different crimes. But there was a lady on the jury that was a staunch Trump supporter. And since Paul Manafort had been his campaign, in charge of his campaign, she didn't want anything negative to happen to him. But the evidence was so strong in 8 of the indictments that even she couldn't exonerate him. So instead of him going to jail for under 18 counts, he only went to jail under 8 counts, which means he'll spend 30 years in jail instead of 50 years in jail. Of course, he's in his 60s, so if he gets out in 30 years, then I'll probably already be dead. Anyway. What just happened last week? Oh, Roger Stone was convicted of all 8 counts. Or was it 6? Anyway, he's going to go to jail for a while as well. Another friend of Trump, who was caught in the Mueller investigation. Psychologists have examined factors that affect the accuracy of jury verdicts. We have learned that evidentiary strength is probably the most important determinant of jurors' verdicts in both civil and criminal trials. So it all depends on how strong the evidence is as to whether they're convicted or whether they are exonerated. Effects of extralegal information. Jury decisions can also be influenced by extralegal information. For example, irrelevant information about the defendant's background, appearance, and race. Some people watch too much television, and every time they see a bad guy, he is African American. If you watch Cops, there are 2 types of bad people. There are black people that are bad, and there are Hispanics with shaved heads. They're bad as well. So anybody with a shaved head is a automatic criminal, and anybody with dark skin is an automatic criminal. That's what we see on Cops. So their appearance, their background, whether they have a suit on, whether they have a do-rag on, all of these things can convict an individual because of extralegal information, prejudices of the jury. Why are jury decisions influenced by irrelevant information? Calvin and Zeisel's 1966 liberation hypothesis. When the evidence in a case clearly favors one side, juries will decide the case in favor of that side. And that is known as the liberation hypothesis. However, according to the liberation hypothesis, if the evidence is ambiguous, the jurors are liberated and allowed to rely on their assumptions, their sentiments, and their biases. And of course, this is the extralegal evidence that we were talking about before in reaching their verdict. So if they will follow the evidence, and if the evidence is, if it's a slam dunk, then of course they will have to convict. Just like the lady who was a staunch Trump supporter, she didn't want to convict Manafort, but in 8 of the counts, the evidence was so strong, even she couldn't exonerate Manafort for what he did. However, if the evidence is ambiguous, then they can use their assumptions, their sentiments, and their biases. And that's what she did. She was the only individual that voted against those 10 indictments. She's the only one that was against that. And of course, it had to be a unanimous decision. So on 10 counts, they were not able to convict Manafort, and for those 8, it was a slam dunk, and he was convicted, even by a prejudiced juror. One can understand jurors' attention to extralegal information by applying cognitive experiential self-theory. When jurors deliberately focus on evidence provided during a trial, they are relying on rationally based system, a rationally based system of information processing. That is likely to occur when the evidence is unambiguous and comprehensible. But when the evidence is contradictory or confusing, jurors may be more likely to rely on an experientially based system. And this, of course, is the extra-legal system that we were talking about before. So what have you experienced? I told you about the murder trial, that my brother was, he was a juror on that murder trial because he knew about weapons, and he had been around weapons not most of his life, only after joining the military. But he understood weapons, and he understood how triggers work. And he understood how, he understood anger, he understood rage, he understood all these things. Because of that, he retried the case in the jury room. They didn't just use the information that they had. And they came up with a verdict that the judge didn't expect. The judge expected that they would convict him of first-degree murder because he shot his wife and killed her. He grabbed the gun away from her and shot her. But when he grabbed the gun away from her, the gun went off. And the barrel, luckily for him, the barrel was pointed at her, not at him. It was a hair trigger, but it wasn't a hair trigger. He had to pull the trigger really hard, but it became a hair trigger the closer it got to fire. And that's what they proved. That's what my brother proved. Anyway, so the guy didn't actually pull the trigger. The gun just went off when they jiggled it. The influence of prior record evidence, and it really doesn't matter whether the guy meant to shoot her or not. That was the verdict. That's what the jury came up with. So that's you know, the guy could have been planning this all along. Here, hit me, and then I'm going to take a gun and shoot you. Of course, that's not the evidence that was out there. The influence of prior record evidence. Once jurors have heard evidence about a defendant's prior criminal record, they may be prejudiced by it and judge the current offense in light of those past misdeeds. So the prosecution is often not permitted to introduce this as evidence. Now, the strange part is that this is usually the first thing that a reporter is looking for the criminal record or the mental health record of the individual that commits the crime. So that is usually part of the pre-trial publicity. How many times has this guy been in trouble? Yeah, I did that and I didn't look to see what time it was. Okay. So usually the prosecution is not permitted to introduce the criminal record of the individual. Now, we were talking about this before. If you put the defendant on the stand, then the prosecution can ask him about his criminal record. So this is one of the reasons why defendants very often will not testify, especially if they have a criminal record. If they have no record at all, then it's very likely that they will testify in their own defense. But if they do have a criminal record, they don't want the criminal record to come out. If the defendant opts to testify, then prosecutors may be able to question them about certain types of prior criminal involvement. Excuse me. If the defendant takes the witness stand, the judge may also issue a limiting instruction. Evidence of a defendant's prior record can be used to gauge the defendant's credibility, but not to prove the defendant's propensity to commit the charged offense. In other words, they can ask him about how truthful he is. If he has been convicted of lying in the past, then this information can come out, because that has to do with his credibility. This is what's going on right now with the inquiry. Because one of the things that Donald Trump is trying to do, he's trying to paint these individuals as haters of Trump. He calls them never-Trumpers. In other words, they didn't want Trump to become president, and they would never want Trump to be president. So he tries to paint them as never Trumpers, which means that, of course, they are willing to lie in order to get him impeached. Okay. There's also a thing that he has that the conservative media have this conspiracy theory of the dark state. The dark state has to do with people that are professional government employees. They work for both sides. They work for either Republicans or Democrats. It doesn't really matter who's in power. And these individuals have their own ideas about how the government should be run. That's the idea. So these individuals he refers to as dark staters, or people that are members of the dark state. In other words, they're not loyal to him. And he's trying to get rid of some of these individuals. If they, at one point, he wanted people to state that they were loyal to Donald Trump, and they would never testify against him. I know. So there are a lot of people that work in the White House have had to take this loyalty oath. As weird as that sounds. I guess it doesn't sound that weird, does it? We've had this problem before. Limiting instructions are rarely effective. Juries apparently rely on their knowledge of the prior record to convict defendants when other evidence in the case against them was weak. So despite the fact that the evidence isn't very strong, if they have committed a crime in the past, then a lot of times they will convict them just on their past record rather than the evidence that they have. The impact of character and propensity evidence. Character evidence can be used to provide evidence on guilt when it is relevant to the defendant, the alleged victim, or a witness. Although positive character evidence has little impact on jurors' judgments, evidence about negative character traits increases the likelihood of conviction. So if this individual is not a very nice person, and they can state this by bringing a witness that talks about how bad this person has been in the past, then potentially they can convict him on his bad behavior from before. However, you remember the case of the young man who was 18 years old and he raped the young lady. And the judge acquitted him because he said he didn't want to ruin his life. This conviction would, of course, put this on his record, and he would have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. And the judge decided that since he comes from a good family, since he comes from a wealthy family, that he wasn't going to convict him. And of course, that case went national, and everybody was pretty pissed off about it. Evidence of other crimes or wrongdoing. Propensity evidence is also typically inadmissible. However, sex crimes are treated differently. In 1994, Congress passed a law making evidence of other sex offenses admissible to show a defendant's propensity to commit the charged sex offense. Of course, this came up in the Kavanaugh hearings. Brett Kavanaugh had allegedly had attacked a young lady when he was 17 years old. He was 17, she was 15 years old. That was what the argument was all about. So the question came up, can we talk about this? And of course, the people that wanted him to be a Supreme Court justice said, no, we can't talk about this. This isn't right. This is evidence from the past, and it can't come forward. But eventually it did come out, and they tried to denigrate the individual that had brought the case before the Supreme Court or before Congress. Impact of extra legal information in criminal cases. Although the vast majority of civil cases are resolved outside the courtroom, thousands of civil cases are tried before juries each year. Juries in these cases typically make two fundamental decisions: whether the defendant, or in some instances the plaintiff, is liable or responsible for the alleged harm, whether the injured party, typically the plaintiff, should receive any money to compensate for his or her losses, and if so, what amount. These monies are called damages, and of course, that has to be paid to whoever has been damaged. Determining liability, jurors must determine the party's respective responsibility for the harm that was suffered. Jurors should decide liability on the basis of the defendant's conduct. And of course, there was the case of the Ford Pinto, where the Ford Pinto was if it was hit from behind, then it was bursting into flames, and sometimes the people were killed. Ford Motor Company was held liable for that. Oh, Ford has just come out with an electric car. Nobody even knew they were even working on an electric car. And here all of a sudden they come out with an electric car. It's a Mustang. It's called the Mach-E rather than the Mach-1. That was their fast car. This is the Mach-E. Evidently it has, it can go 300 miles on one charging, which is pretty good. The severity of an injury or accident, sometimes referred to as outcome severity, though legally relevant to decisions about the damage award, should be irrelevant to the judgment concerning liability or legal responsibility. Although the legal system expects jurors to evaluate liability objectively, jurors' emotional reactions also influence their assessment of the facts and evidence. All right. These are civil cases, assessing damages. Jurors put most weight on the evidence they hear in court, but they sometimes consider attorneys' fees and whether any loss is covered by insurance, issues that are theoretically irrelevant to decisions about damages. So when we're talking about lawyers' fees, how much do lawyers get if they win a case? Let's say the award, the damages are $1 million. How much money will the lawyer get? Yes. $1 million. How much will they get?
I'm going to say maybe a quarter.
$20.
Yeah,
It's a good guess.
half.
I was gonna say.
It's not right, but it's a good guess.
Say about 35%.
Yeah, it's a third. They get a third. So if it's a $3 million settlement, they get $1 million. And here's the bizarre part. All of this is taxed, but they get their money before they get taxed. I know. So all the lawyers' fees, this is the lawyers' fees. Any cost incurred, that comes off the top as well. They still get a third. So they'll always get their $1 million. And then sometimes, and this is how people lose money. So the settlements for $3 million. The lawyer fees are $1 million because they get a third. And then they'll charge you $30 an hour. And then you have to pay that as well. So every time they think about the case, it counts as an hour.
But are these good lawyers? I mean,
They win,
so what happens if they don't win?
then they still get their lawyer fees. You still have to pay them. And all that money that they charged you, all the hours that they thought about your case,
Mhm.
or they worked on your case, they bill you for all those hours. You know. So let's say they have 5 lawyers working on your case. Each one of those lawyers, every time he works on your case, gets his fee, whatever it is. Sometimes it's $100 an hour. So if you have 5 lawyers working on your case, and they spend 8 hours working on your case, that's $800 you owe. And it's kind of a rip-off. It's a lot of fun though, because we're talking about lots and lots of money. This is one of the reasons why lawyers have money. Evidence indicates a judge's admonition to disregard inadmissible evidence is relatively ineffective. So if they say something, that information cannot be taken out of your brain. I know. The jury is supposed to disregard that piece of testimony. These instructions can backfire and result in jurors being more likely to use the inadmissible evidence. And this is known as reactance theory, which explains the instructions to disregard evidence may threaten jurors' freedom to consider all available evidence. And of course, that is part of the way this thing works as well. So any information that comes out during a jury trial, if the jury's in the room, there's just no way they can forget it. They're not going to throw that out. It's going to be in their minds, and it's going to affect the way that they find when they deliberate. Why don't we stop right here and we'll pick this up on Thursday.